Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Leon and Stephen. Stephen again, Leon first time. As Jean says, old comrade, colleague. We've exchanged
Not
work.
old, but long term.
This is the beauty of bringing your spouse to you
Sorry,
have your
but we date each other.
autocorrect. you have this is the
Co-evilness is, I think, the fashionable word.
otherwise known as your spiritual autocorrect. Yes, of long standing, and I'll say something about that in a moment. Leon has his doctorate from the University of South Africa, his MA from the University of Leeds, and his BA Honours from the University of Johannesburg. Until 2014, was Professor of the Department of English in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Before that, was Head of School and Personal Professor, School of Literature and Language in the Faculty of Humanities at Wits. And before that, a lecturer at the University of South Africa. Before that, interestingly, a sub-editor and a chief sub-editor, an arts writer and a reporter in 3 of South Africa's newspapers. So we actually have somebody who has worked in the media about which we speak a great deal, but have very little control over ourselves. Leon has an extraordinary range of awards, accomplishments, etc. He was winner of the South African Literary Awards Prize for Literary Translation for Intimately Absent, has translated poetry, has won several prizes in that mode, and won a South African Translators Institute Award for his translation of Marlene Paniket's Triumph, which is a remarkable accomplishment, a remarkable novel, a remarkable translation. He has also won several prizes for his translations of poetry. Leon also has published, I think it's 3 volumes of poetry and a novel, back in that in a moment, and being the editor of several journals. So a long-standing autocorrect history of professional service and academic accomplishment. Leon's current book project is Losing the Plot, Crime, Reality and Fiction in Post-Apartheid Writing, from which this paper is taken. But he is also, very interestingly, just being contracted by Penguin Random House South Africa to write the authorized biography of Andre Brink, something to which we all look forward to. You better bloody write it soon. His best-known book, I think, is Civilizing Barbarians, Missionary Narrative and African Textual Response in 19th Century South Africa, a work to which Jean and I have a very close affinity, it having been written roughly the same time as we were writing Revelation and Revolution, and it is an extraordinary book. Among the creative work, other than the 3 volumes of poetry, comes an original novel under the title of Bad Sex, for which we're waiting for the sequel.
The movie. The movie.
Well, what comes after Bad Sex? Worse sex or better sex? I literally do not have time to read much of Leon's other writings. He has 3 articles in peer-reviewed journals in press, 44 published and reviewed articles, and 17 book chapters. And as I said, several literary translations. I love the progression of your translations, the titles that is. Flame in the Snow, The Road of Excess, in Love's Place, Before It Darkens, Intimately Absence, and Triumph. Now, shouldn't Triumph actually come between Love's Place and Before Darkness? There is a sort of a serialization that is extremely interesting. And has also actually performed a literary translation, The Chronicles of Magdalena, which you performed at the Fugard Theatre, right? Which is, again, a remarkable accomplishment. As if this makes plain, Leon has an extraordinary curriculum vitae. And every now and again I pull out a title that is memorable. This one is utterly non-memorable. It is called Fawn Against the Comoros. Right. Literally published in the South African Historical Journal. Unfortunately, I don't remember it at all.
Now you tell us.
Right. I won't ask whether it was more forward.
It was subtitled Postmodernist Puffery,
Yeah,
or
exactly.
and it was in defense of the Comoros.
I know, it was.
Thank you.
I tell you somehow, what I was going to close with was this, that in a lot of debate around revolution, what first caught our attention was the extraordinary fineness of your reading of that book. A book which was, as you know, grotesquely misread and misquoted very often. And when you wrote your reading of it, both of us were blown away with the sensitivity that you brought to it. So it's a pleasure doubly to bring you in this context. Stephen will get a shorter introduction since he has been introduced severally before. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, Stephen. Stephen is Distinguished Professor of English and the Director of the Interdisciplinary Studies Institute at UMass Amherst. He received his PhD from the University, a DPhil from the University of Oxford, and has taught at UMass since 1989, where he was also chair of the English department from 1994 to 2000. His fellowships include South African Research Program at Yale, the African Studies Institute at Wits, the Society for the Humanities at Cornell, the Woodrow Wilson, hopefully soon to be renamed, International Institute for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies. Stephen's work is very well known for his work on the novels of Nadine Gordimer, of whose work he also edited a collection. His biography of Brian Fisher, which won the Alan Paton Award for non-fiction, South Africa's most prestigious award, and a quite remarkable book. And The Grammar of Identity, Transnational Fiction, Nature and the Boundary, published by Oxford in 2009. Most recently, a memoir entitled Birthmark, which was published by Jacana Media just last year. Stephen, welcome back. It's a pleasure to have you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Leon, over to you for 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, John, for that lovely introduction. So just to say that I am primarily a literary scholar, and this paper, as you've heard, is a shortened version of a chapter from my book, Losing the Plot, Crime, Reality and Fiction in Post-Apartheid Writing. Although my book works in a cross-disciplinary manner, I do realize that my paper opens questions in other disciplines that I may be hard-pressed to answer very well. The book itself seeks to identify trends in South African writing that have taken root since the contested transition from apartheid to something beyond apartheid, conveniently captured in the terms post-apartheid and even post-apartheid, which is where some people think we are, but many others don't, and we'd hotly dispute that. So those terms remain problematic in much a way that the term post-colonial also to this day remains problematic. And as many commentators would agree, South Africa may be temporarily beyond the threshold of the apartheid era, as in beyond government by a white minority, but whether the country is beyond apartheid in socio-economic terms, and indeed whether it is even beyond colonization, is a different matter entirely and hotly disputed inside the country right now. So in keeping with such conceptual instability about the actual state of the country, is it beyond apartheid or not? My book pivots around the contested but key notion of the transition, and more pertinently, the supposed transition to a state of liberation from apartheid. I hesitate even to use the word revolution. Some people have talked about silent revolution, but liberation is perhaps a safer word to use, and very, very contested that notion is. Did it really happen, or was it a sham? Many people now think it was a sham. For writers and critics of literature alike, the transition is a key moment, something akin to a founding narrative for what was supposed to be post-apartheid literature. And during apartheid, this post-apartheid moment was keenly desired and much dreamed about and talked about and projected into the future, and perhaps also prematurely celebrated, especially in the 90s, when people wrote books like Spring is Rebellious, projecting the glorious futures that we were now embracing. So, like many founding narratives, the transition narrative has since been rendered problematic, its implicit teleology turned on its head, and its manifest content as a threshold from one state to another severely unsettled. Most often the transition has been shown in socio-economic terms to be illusory for most except the privileged elite. However, in symbolic terms, especially in expressive capacities, that is, in the freedom to tell stories and give robust voice to a range of identity positions, beliefs, and perspectives, the transition does seem to have broken through some decisive barriers of the past. As Sarah Nuttall and Cheryl Ann Michael very memorably wrote in their edited book Senses of Culture, the autobiographical voice particularly, they write, is a symptom of the decompression, relaxation, and cacophony of the post-apartheid moment in general, and I think many people would agree with that. As my book's title suggests, the terms crime and reality feature strongly, conditioning our understanding of the third term, fiction. I devote one chapter to a reading of crime fiction, which has seen a notable surge since 1994. I see this trend as a form of social detection in the wake of a widespread sense that the plot of liberation has been lost, amid a more general sense of law and disorder rather than law and order, as a vital nexus not only in Southern Africa but in many other developing regions too. And of course a nod is necessary here to Jean and John for their edited book Law and Disorder in the Post-Colony. In another chapter, I look at non-fiction works that are part of what I see as a major turn towards forms of writing that accentuate the real rather than the fictional, based on what I call an evidential paradigm, borrowing from the work of Carlo Ginzburg. These works not only show a keen forensic bent, an urge to establish precisely what's actually going on in the face of many conflicting narratives and a haze of normalization, but also display what I call temporal mashups, particularly in white post-apartheid works of non-fiction in which the immemorial tropes of the frontier and the journey of discovery come back and break into what is supposed to be a present going into the future kind of time, but presenting instead a kind of future anterior, to borrow Hal Foster's term. The current paper then builds on the dual emphases of crime and reality, homing in on the ascendant category of true crime especially. Works of true crime are in fact selling faster than most other books in the literary category, or most other literary works, not only in the small but energetic South African publishing industry, but in world markets too. And you can see this if you go to Nielsen's Bookscan site. This suggests that Mark Seltzer is not far off the mark when he posits true crime as a key concept in late modernity, finding its place within what he calls a pathological public sphere. When I stumbled onto Seltzer's work, interestingly via an electronic gadget on a train going into New York, it immediately struck me as important for the work I was doing on post-apartheid writing. The idea of what he calls stranger intimates, who even while brushing coats against each other on city trains, may be connecting with each other remotely in a highly energized new media sphere, struck me as a major chord in what was perhaps going on in a post-apartheid South Africa too. Mass subjects no longer always have the luxury of Habermasian coffee shop interlocution. There are too many of us, and we're all too much in a hurry, always moving, sending both our bodies and our messages in different directions at the same time. However, we do have various access points to what Seltzer calls the media a priori, which does not require co-presence for communication, and which has expanded into digital forms such that it becomes a prime locus for people's self-realization as mass subjects. In his work on wound culture and the so-called pathological public sphere, Seltzer identifies addictive violence as not merely a collective spectacle, but one of the crucial sites where private desire and public spaces cross. And then Michael Warner, in his article, The Mass Public and Mass Subject, says the mass subject cannot have a body except the body it witnesses. He argues further that the transitive pleasure of witnessing injury makes available our translation into the disembodied publicity of the mass subject. I wanted to take this further, though, into the more immediate and, dare I say, concrete terrain of post-apartheid true crime, within what we might see as the pathological public sphere of post-apartheid. Since it struck me that a great amount of energy, writing energy that is, was going into this area. In my paper, I cite examples of media witnessing in thickly recirculating loops of social media, especially of horrific public events such as Andris Tatane's killing by police in full view of the media in 2011. And there are many other examples as well. My extension of the argument is that such hyper-mediated events often have pronounced socio-political determinations. In such cases, that is, accidents, crimes, or the effects of incompetence and or corruption, onlooker citizens are affectively engaged on behalf of the victims, and they experience a simultaneous personal sense of injury. So we're dealing with referred pain via deferred witnessing within what Seltzer calls a cult of commiseration, or the wound culture in general. This is arguably a more general effect in the South African case of plot loss, assaulting any claim to personal security in a climate where cheek-by-jowl neighbors, fellow citizens, are subject to deadly conditions. In the wake of events that arise from such conditions, social media memes proliferate, each more toxic than the last, so that this sense of personal injury accelerates and deepens as the movement that has come to be known as fallism, or the hashtag wars of 2015-16 so dramatically demonstrate. For example, Rhodes must fall, Zuma must fall, fuck white people, and the like. I like that one. The efficacy, truth, and justness of such memes is, of course, a different matter, and their amplification is often seen as out of proportion to the actual scale of material conditions. Ashil Mbembe recently wrote, I hope he doesn't mind if I quote him, psychic bonds, in particular bonds of pain and bonds of suffering, more than lived material contradictions, are becoming the real stuff of political intersubjectivity. I am my pain, quote unquote. How many times have I heard this statement, says Mbembe, in the months since Rhodes Must Fall emerged? I am my suffering. And this subjective experience is so incommensurable that unless you have gone through the same time, you will never understand my condition, unquote. The fusion of self and suffering, writes Mbembe, in this astonishing age of solipsism and narcissism. Nevertheless, referred pain remains a major factor in current post-apartheid discourse, and we need to recognize it for what it is, perhaps if only to disaggregate claim from material condition, and how we do that is a very interesting question, and how we go about doing that. And what registers of persuasion would be used? Are they scholarly? Are they demagogic? Are they rhetorical? What will actually take? It's not clear. Or they're institutional. Perceived neglect by powers that be, whether these be self-absorbed politicians or distracted university vice-chancellors or presidents, as you'd say in this country, is felt to be atrocious and shameful, eliciting a widespread sense of disgust, personally felt, that is instantly communicable in digital form. The contact zone between the private and the public, for Seltzer, the scene of the accident, where torn and open bodies and torn and open psyches, in his language, are displayed for public consumption, is also the place where the actual and the professed are played off against each other, and quote-unquote political bullshit is exposed, which is a very popular term for South Africans who think there's bullshit around every corner, which may well be true. There is a keen appetite for... So that's why there is a keen appetite for such exposure, which involves the unmasking of people and institutions that are seen or perceived to be distorting the truth. That is the space where true crime narratives appear to be assuming such significance. And I suppose also the space where writing, one's conception of writing emerging from literature coalesces with a more general climate of discourse and public opinion. And for scholars of literature, it's an interesting question. Where do you make that demarcation? Where do you say, well, this is where literature ends, and the rest of that stuff is just political discourse? I believe you can't get away with saying that quite so easily because of the cultural energy that's going into those forms of expression. As Greg Marinovich's Dispatches of Americana in the Daily Maverick, now a book called Murder at Small Copy, very strongly show. So there's a very interesting crossover between those two areas. I'm already in danger of talking too much at this stage, so let me just add that in my book, I argue that writing is a category that exceeds the demarcation of literature, and I've just said that. And the once ascendant category of imaginative of literature has slipped somewhat into the background in post-apartheid, which is very different from the situation before 1994. Much of the energy of writing is now found in the unstable, hard-to-hold steady digital forums that have come for many to supersede paper-printed words or the paper-printed word. My discussion of Mark Gewisser's non-fiction work Lost and Found in Johannesburg serves to show just how powerful is the incursion of true crime into this very space of the well-written or belletristic literary work. In this case, literally holding up, criminally and time-wise, holding back, interrupting his book, forcing him to go back to the drawing board, postponing publication, and changing the face of a book that was meant to be less about crime and more about regenerative outcomes. And then finally, I should mention that the rest of this chapter, from which this talk is taken, goes on to discuss Mzilikazi wa Africa's non-fiction work, Nothing Left to Steal, and Greg Marinovich's Dispatches on Marikana, the Marikana Massacre, 2012, for the digital news source, the Daily Maverick, which has now been taken up in a book called Murder at Small Copy.
Okay, thank you. Stephen.
Right, well, thanks again to Jean and John for inviting me, and in particular thanks to Leon for this incredibly stimulating paper, which I found thoroughly thought-provoking all the way through. I took loads of notes and feel that I could talk for a couple of hours about
You're not going to talk for a couple of hours.
I'm going to stick to my 10 minutes. I'll stick to my 10 minutes. But I think here you see one of the reasons why Leon is such an influential critic and scholar. His sense of the theoretical and global context for South African writing, the zest and energy of his own writing. So much of what I say will be riffing off things that he's already said. So it seems to me, as by way of a starting point, as I was thinking about it, there are 5 different axes which kind of come together in this paper. And all of them have to do with the nature of experience and the communicability of experience. There's an axis across global space intersecting with South African space through the techno-cultural environment in which we all live. There's an axis across temporal space from the apartheid to post-apartheid era, or in a different guise from about 1994 to about 2014, a 20-year period. There's an axis across media space from the digital telemetric to the world of writing, and something about that relationship, how they relate. There's an axis across genre space, from fiction to non-fiction. And finally, I think there's an interesting relationship, a shift from a sequential arrow, which kind of goes from experience to cultural expression. In other words, I have the experience and then I write about it, to one in which the arrow goes from the cultural surround to the nature of communicable experience. What is it, not only that I can express, but how does it affect the nature of what I experience? Okay. I do wonder, though, and this is an open question, what the fit is between these different axes, whether they are homologous or whether there are fault lines between them and among them or within them that are worth exploring, and some of which I think Leon does explore in this paper. I want to begin with the fiction-non-fiction question, which people have spoken about, and Leon has discussed it here, and the general observation that fiction is now obsolete. With due respect to the people who say that, Hedley Twyddle, Marlene van Niekerk, Ike Kock, I think the death of fiction is somewhat exaggerated. But more important, I think that the fiction-non-fiction binary is somewhat overdone. I don't actually see it as being all that distinct. All you need to do, if you want to see that fiction is not dead, is look at Marlene van Niekerk's own work, and Leon's done this fantastic translation of Triumph. But think of works like the work of Ivan Vladislavich, who calls Portrait with Keys a documentary fiction, combining those categories in interesting ways. And so I feel, as Leon suggests, that the larger category is the category of writing. And one of my questions here this afternoon is, what is it that writing can do in these circumstances? What can it do, and how can we read it? Okay, so that'll be a theme for me. And some of this has to do with genre and surface. Okay, so we get this telemetric cultural surround, which Leon gives a fantastic description. It's a tour de force in its own way. And a shift in his view from a relatively elitist, highbrow concern of fiction in the old form to an imbrication, and I'm quoting here, within a mediated public sphere in which affect and surface, the raw and the real, loop recursively via psychotechnologies in open public forms of witnessing and writing. And I think on some level, that's an obviously persuasive account, but it does make me want to think about how far genre and surface are in a complex, if not complicated, relationship. Is nonfiction, in other words, simply a reflexive form which is kind of the symptom of this cultural surround, the mere expression of it? Or are there questions that we can ask of it? Is there, this may sound like a retrograde question, but if there's little to choose between the Twitter account and the work of autobiography, if the wound narratives of both are more or less equatable, that seems to me a pretty harsh sentence in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something in me that wants to keep asking this question. What is it that writing can do? Don't want to go into this in too much detail, but Leon mentions the work of W.G. Zabalt, and there's something to be said about that, because he's someone who works across the surface of various global settings, who uses photography, but actually those photographs in his books are not real. They're not documents. They're actually falsely referential in some way, in ways that complicate our relationship to the work of writing. And I think Mark's book is somewhat different, doesn't quite do that, but I still think that writing can do some of that. I would say, and this is a separate point now, that writing and its relationship to the real has a long and complicated history in South Africa. And that sense of overload has been there, I would say, going back to the 1950s, if not before. The sense that the real was so weird, so strange, that writing could not possibly do justice to it. It wasn't just that the literary couldn't measure up to the real, but the real had its own dimensions, weird dimensions of literariness already embedded in it.
Exactly.
Which can't be matched. And I think that one way of reading South African literature and its history is as a series of responses to that problem. How are we going to measure up to this? And so, although this current moment may appear apocalyptic in some way, the end of time, where do we go from here? I think in some ways it may involve a set of aesthetic reprises of an old question in which we are now in a new reformulation of an old problem. Okay. So I think to say that writing, I'm not saying Leon says this, but if someone were to suggest that writing has no purchase or even purpose in this setting, I think would be maybe a way of contributing to the problem of the overwhelming sense of the surface around us. Mm-hmm. How do we get through that? Okay, a different point again, to do with interiority, the surface, and the symptom. So one issue that intrigues me is what happens to interiority in a world of purely expressive, reflexive surface. Where does it go? If the wound is on the surface, if we all experience it together in some way in which it's always mediated and remediated, what happens to that other dimension of pain? If I'm my pain, at what level does one feel this, and where does writing relate to this? And I think it's interesting that in Lost and Found, that dimension is thematized to some extent. There is the story of sexual emergence, the emergence of a sexual identity, kind of cartographical experience of Johannesburg, the world of the ancestors. There's a scene in a cemetery where Mark goes and finds his great-grandparents, gravestones. I kind of wish he'd done a little more of that. It's a book I like a lot. I have to say I like it because I'm in it twice, okay? But it's in its own way.
Very incestuous.
What about the other 418 pages?
What do you say? But the interesting thing to me about that book, and here I agree with Leon, is in a way how interiority gets externalized in that book. So it's not only as Lost and Found in Johannesburg, but Lost and Found as Johannesburg, as the kind of cartography of Johannesburg. And so what happens then to, the world of interiority, which is in theory what autobiography is or could be about? And in some ways here, if there's, loss of the plot, I wonder if we have a kind of meta-pathology of loss here, which is basically the loss of loss. If loss loses its meaning, where do we go? What do we do with that? And I wonder if there's a way of recuperating a different version of symptomatic reading. There's been discussion, Sarah Nuttall among others, that reading for depth, the surface of the book as symptom of some hidden depth, why that's no longer possible. But can we not think about a symptomatic reading in which we're not searching for a hidden depth, but precisely what we're looking at is the notation of a loss of depth, the loss of the possibility of depth, and a kind of hidden grief around that, I would say. Joseph Conrad spoke about a purely spectacular universe. What happens when you live in a purely spectacular universe? So if there's a loss of the plot, I think people can deal with suffering. They can even deal with violence if there's a sense of meaning. But if there's no sense of meaning, then there's the loss of loss. And that seems to me very powerful in what we're talking about. Okay, I've just got a couple more points to make, and they kind of work in contrary directions. I want to think about lost and found specifically. And one point relates to true crime, which Leon has evoked very, very powerfully, and the other to the invasion moment in the context of the book as a whole. Mm-hmm. So Leon makes a compelling case that Lost and Found is held up by the invasion scene. That's what made Mark go back to his editors and postpone the book for a year, and maybe this interrupts the flow of the narrative. But, as I'm thinking with the literary critic in me, and I'm sure in Leon, as well, it feels to me you could actually reverse that question in a way in which the book is not held up by that narrative, but actually propelled by it.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how Mark uses it. It opens the book in brief.
Yeah.
You're going to go a long stretch through the whole book, and it comes back not at the end, but towards the end.
Yeah.
So this is the hook. Okay, it gets you going. It gets you where you're going. And not only that, it gives the book its arc, its kind of coiled spring, the tension against which the resolution of finding in that wonderful scene in Hillbrow at the end can work. So this is a different kind of mark in the book, if I can pun in that way. It's the mark of writing is topological and tropological, the tropes that writing uses. In other words, I see genre in this as well. And I have to say, and I hope this won't sound too cynical, but it also serves a different kind of mark, and that is the market. What publishers see in South Africa, the invasion moment standing as metonym for South Africa as a whole, for a whole series of experiences. It becomes legible, it becomes recognizable. I'm not saying that that's how Mark Visser wrote the book, but it's how editors read it, and it's also how it gets presented in certain ways. In various ways then, and I think intrinsic to the actual purpose of this book, we can see the book as being not only held up or lost in the moment of invasion, but actually, in narrative terms, found in that moment of invasion. There's something that's going on there.
Absolutely.
And then finally, and again, contrary to this, I think that there's a lot going on in Lost and Found that doesn't have to do with the attack scene. I've suggested this. Tales of sexual liberation, hidden shadows, family histories, the subterranean world of Johannesburg, which Mark Visser finds in the third basement of the Johannesburg Library. It's down rather than just on the surface. And so Leon says, and I think again, I found his paper incredibly compelling just for the force with which it's written. He says, how else is one to read the events that Visser narrates other than to identify with the atrocity exhibition via deferred witnessing and referred pain? And I think one possibility is to read it as a kind of dialogue with that pain, as a set of fault lines within the drives of the text itself, part of a different kind of narrative logic, and therefore maybe, I'd like to suggest maybe, as part of a genre which exceeds, or maybe not enough, the templates of surface and wound. In other words, for me it takes us back to the question of what writing can do, the possibilities of what writing can achieve.
Thank you. It was fabulous. Okay. Respond to the degree that you want to, and then we'll open up.
Well, I mean, could I get away with saying I agree with most of that? Definitely, one works with the notions of fiction and non-fiction as opposed categories, always knowing and always footnoting and always referring to the fact that they in fact constantly play into each other and always have. And so that binary is overdone, especially in the sense that the non-fiction writers who I highlight in my study are constantly, and it's easy to perceive this, using the very best of fictional methods. So Johnny Steinberg does this excellently. So does Anton Albecker. So does Jacob Dlamini. So do many of the non-fiction writers. And the fiction writers are, as you say, using a form of documentary
Absolutely.
realism.
Sure.
Nowhere better exemplified than Ivan Vladisavich's work, although Marlene van Niekerk's work, Ingrid Winterbach's work also show this trend. So in the deeper argument of the book, I talk about underplotted and overplotted writing. And I argue that fictional work is significantly underplotted and more discourse heavy in the sense that it feels somewhat tenuous about proposing what's going on out there, and is more likely to take in the imprints of the real. It's more of a mind to be in the position of a camera. And you see this very strongly in Ivan Vladisavich's Double Negative, where precisely, which is another one of your points, he plays surface off against depth. One of Vladisavich's great strengths is his ability to do an almost ekphrastic account of visual surfaces and their gaudiness and their supposed lack of depth in a sort of cultural sense. For example, his descriptions of Troyville in Johannesburg and other parts of Johannesburg, and the nouveau riche sort of palaces, the faux classical sort of housing complexes in the exploded view.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he's doing precisely that. He's registering the dialectic of the possible loss of depth, what the surface does tell you about what one might seek and not find if you're looking for depth. So I agree very much about the relationship of the real and the fictional having a long and troubled history in South Africa, and particularly that sense that many critics have talked about, which is that the real was almost unrepresentable, that fiction had to stand back to reality in South Africa. And I do think, though, that for some reason that I'm seeking to find, put my finger on the pulse of, there's the most celebrated. I mean, non-fiction has always been a big form. So so they've always been working alongside each other. But during the apartheid years, fiction came to occupy the preeminent space. You take the obvious examples of Nadine Gordimer in your book's terms, History from the Inside, when it seemed that history had to be shown as being witnessed from within the perceptual eye of witnessing people through fiction, mediated through intelligence of the writer's perspective and varial narrative perspectives. And something has happened following the transition that has led to this feeling that the difficulties, the occulted nature of the real, and the toxic and dangerous substance of that real needs to be approached in a different manner, in a more direct manner. So the accent I feel has turned more towards non-fiction writing. Those points are very well taken. And your 5 axes, I don't think they're homologous, but I do think they're very well perceived, and they are playing into what's going on in post-apartheid writing space. Just a few comments on Lost and Found. Definitely, I say that the invasion interrupts the book, holds it up, but without a doubt, it propels the narrative and it speeds it up, and it provides a thrilling sort of cover story in a sense. It opens and does just about close with that. And some critics have noted that it provides a nice uptick in an otherwise meandering. Not that I agree with that, but I think it was Hedley Twiddle who wrote it. Was a bit of a like listening to a dinner conversation that was going on for too long, and then came this event and just gave it a bit of a bump. Yes, the invasion moment standing as a metonym for the market and what the market expects. I think definitely you find this all over the place in Vladislavic as well, and in Gavissa. The sense of knowing what is apparently expected of you and playing with it. And parrying it, I mean, this notion of reflexive modernity, always watching itself watching, is something that these non-fiction writers do very well. So I also agree very much with the notion of the dialogue of exceeding surface and the loss of loss. Thank you for that point. Yeah, very profound point. You can deal with the loss of meaning, or you can deal with loss, but you cannot deal with the loss of meaning. And I think this is something of the kind that we're experiencing at the moment, with the loss of a meta category, the loss of an ability to be in a position to feel, as the fallism debate seems to suggest, that if you're not in the right identity position, you're not in a position to feel the pain that other people are feeling, and therefore you have no right to speak. So the loss of not only meaning, the loss of that sort of sense of being able to feel lost, but also the loss of an ability to take part in the conversation.
Legitimacy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, I hope we'll come back in the conversation. I have several people already lined up to this question of the intersection of the axes, because of course the interesting thing about Celso, with whom we've also been working for a while, is that his is not it's a techno-historical, right, that has nothing to do with colonial or post-colonial or indeed Africa or anything else.
Yes.
So maybe we'll get a chance to go back to that. Jess, would you like to begin?
Sure.
I'm taking questions, folks.
Yeah, go ahead. Thanks very much. This was a really interesting paper.
Oh, sorry. The orb.
The orb of office.
Yes, thanks. This was a really interesting paper, and thanks for bringing my and others' attention to this book. The excerpt was really, as you say, riveting. My question is, I love the title also, Losing the Plot, by the way. I think it's great. But one question I do have about it, and it's kind of a pushback on this idea of a sense of loss. And so my question is, like, whose anxieties, I guess, are we talking about? Like, what's kind of this audience? And I ask that because I come from, in my own work, thinking about younger writers, but also more so filmmakers than literature, actually. And my interest in science fiction, so much more interested in the fiction side than the nonfiction side per se. But you mentioned in the paper, for example, the sort of harkening back to the good old days of Mandela, and I think rather what I see is much more sort of a resurrection of Biko. Yeah, I guess this thing of science fiction as well, I mean, things like xenophobia, for example, as a recent sort of post-apartheid moment, right? Getting picked up and worked out in modes like District 9, for example, which is very much cinema verite, but sci-fi verite, right? It's got a realism to it that's really important to it, but then with this drastically alien vibe happening as well. And also things like Zoo City, which dealt with xenophobia quite a bit as well, and also public arts performances that happened after that. So this need to sort of grapple with things like that in this very creative way. And also you mentioned Paul Virilio, for example, and this great stuff in here about the collision of bodies and technology, which again, to me, just speaks of a something, an anxiety that is dealt with in a way that is very much far from nonfiction. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So whose anxiety?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I suppose I'm speaking from the sense of primarily the anxiety of South African citizen subjects, but also of the many onlookers and interested parties elsewhere who have been and still are invested in Mandela's sort of master narrative of reconciliation. And there was such a palpable sense of being on the brink as the 1990s arrived, being on the brink of civil war, and even in the days leading up to the elections in 1994, and even during the negotiations that led to those elections, there was an ongoing sort of civil war, particularly in one part of the country, KwaZulu-Natal, but elsewhere too, that rendered the possibility of getting to where the country appeared to get to at that historic moment, 1994, rendered it all but impossible or apparently impossible, so that when it was achieved or apparently achieved, the anxieties of South Africans to some extent were quelled because those anxieties have a long history of so-called black peril narratives, a deep, centuries-long sense of the ground that one stands on in Southern Africa being shaky. And J.M. Coetzee writes about this in Youth, the long backward sort of history of blood and a shaky sense of existence, particularly for white people in the country, but also for everybody who came into contact with white people. So we had the 100 Years' War in the 19th century. And you find in post-apartheid writing, there's a return to that sense of the frontier. Johnny Steinberg's book, Midlands, goes in the early years of the 2000s into Natal and finds himself writing yet again a frontier narrative, yet again a narrative of conflict right at the point of life and death, and the only way to settle things is to kill. So the disorientation that follows this, what I call loss of plot, in some senses does lead to kind of cyberpunk type writing. Lauren Bierkes is the example here, where the register becomes a strange medley of sort of upbeat sci-fi type or cyberpunk type styling of scene and character with a social situation that is suffused with pathology and the imminence of death, but in which people somehow survive quite almost in a chipper manner. So you get that, and you find that kind of feeling in District 9 as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a strange, upbeat sort of story of doom. And there are many of these generic blends coming up at the moment.
Yeah.
I don't know if that sort of gets to your question.
Yeah.
Do you want to follow up? Yeah. Okay. Pass to Sarah and then to Mark next to her.
Thank you very much for your paper. One of the things that I've been trying to think through that I think is very much in relation to things that you're talking about is that I read recently over the Chimurenga African Cities readers to kind of get a sense of the ways people are talking about African cities now, particularly as it relates to things like violence. And part of my question is about this idea of the loss of loss, because it seems to me, I mean, and this is particularly true for South Africa, but even with like Philip de Boek's work and other people, they're talking about the African city is founded on segregation. That part of the postmodern turn has been really making cities the site of abolishing segregation, but in ways in which where we get this like visible, invisible dichotomy that I think we can talk about as the interior versus exterior in the novel. violence is being moved into a visible sphere. And there's a sense to me that when people talk about intimate violence and the intimate violence of the city, there's like some emancipatory tone in it finally being visible, where the destruction of apartheid was in its invisible nature, but same with many other African cities. But then with Markavista, right at the end, we get this like very private violence. It's in the apartment, but then he's taken into the room, it's in the bedroom, like even Markavista doesn't see it. And so that it seems to me there's a crisis of, well, the city then does hide it too. The city, which was supposed to be this open venue that gave some sort of emancipatory sign to visible violence, is being called into question both in the book, but also the Roads Must Fall stuff is about, at this point, burning things in public as a gesture of visible violence that was supposed to be the tone that is now, but it's still hiding in invisible.
Yes, point is well taken. The Roads Must Fall campaign definitely has a sense of a need to bring into open forms that which is being experienced personally in people's memories and in their experiences. And I think that's different from what Seltzer calls the closed room model of true crime, sort of sequestration, where the only expression of politics is, or he talks about a privatization, and that the personal is the political. But I do think the point you're making is a good counterpoint to that. I don't know whether Stephen would like to comment.
Yeah. Stephen, do you want to come back on that before we move to Mark?
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I do think that violence under apartheid was visible, some of it was, today is Sharpeville Day, for goodness sake, so there was stuff that, but I think that the dialectic between the visible and the invisible has always been really interesting. A lot of it happened, yes, in invisible situations of torture, in police stations, in John Forster Square, and so on. So now I just, I don't know if we're in a dramatically different phase. It just, again, it feels to me like a morphing, a morphology in which these things get recycled in different ways. Can I just say, I had this in my notes, but I didn't really feel I had time to talk about it. I'm just going to put it out there. When I think about the scene, the attack scene, the violence, the rape scene, in this book, I have to think about disgrace. And we're talking about fiction.
We all think about disgrace, and so is he.
And so, and again, it happens off-scene. It's not really witnessed. And why could Coetzee put that in the book? That's a whole other different question, But these motifs are, getting recycled, regenerated in some way, in narrative terms. And
it's extremely interesting.
It's just intriguing to me.
Is one of the dominant metaphors of colonial violence.
And why? That's why I wonder why Coetzee used it. He used it. It came out of 300 years of colonial history.
Exactly.
That scene, and I'm not saying this. Mark is very careful about it. This is something that happened, and I think he deals with it very, very carefully. But nonetheless, that question of intimate violence, what can be spoken, what cannot be spoken. If it has happened to you or someone do you have an obligation to speak it, or do you keep it private? How do you surface it? How do you make it visible, legible in some way? So I think these are important questions.
I think this is a really important question, because we can be deluded by the culture of the spectacular to think that what you see is what you get. And the point about it, and there again, I think we have to bring the filmic and the imagic into it. For instance, Ernest Cole's photographs about apartheid makes the point that Sarah's making, is that despite the spectacular nature of it, the bedrock organic sociology happened in those places that were unspoken, the structuring of space, the whole way in which the architecture, before anything was spoken, was already created in ways that are not as spectacularly visible. They're outside of the arc of light. And that becomes a really important question.
Very carefully with the relationship between the visible and the invisible.
Exactly.
And in a sense, neither exists without the other. And in effect, they constantly vote the terror of the other. I think that was true of apartheid as well. I mean, after all, I witnessed any number of cops beating up black folks who didn't have passes on the streets of Sea Point. Yet one knew what was going on in Forster Square. And it was precisely the juxtaposition of those modalities of terror that in effect makes E.V. Walter's point, that the true terror lies as much in this randomness as it does in its systematicity. There's a profound theoretical point in that juxtaposition, I think.
Mark?
Yeah, well, precisely on that point, this unspoken space of this sort of open space or open secret of terror that it hovers between the visible and the invisible. It occurs to me that an ethnographic reading of Kvisser's chapter would probably center on the safe itself, on this very complex signifier. As an ethnographer, one can't think of this as the foundational work of the idea of the social drama in South Africa, development is the social situation, analysis of social situation in South Africa, in which a bridge, a seemingly concrete thing, comes to mean profoundly different things to all the different parties that both binds them and divides them. And that's what the safe is. I mean, I've worked a lot with cross-Limpopo migrants who talk endlessly, have narratives of the safe that are safes that are very closely linked to their ideas about interiority, about wealth, about what's under the ground in Johannesburg, and all the stories, and whether or not it's the train masters or the landlords' safes. And so, they're very disturbing things, of course, about Kvisser's racialized text for all of his humanist attempts. This image of the three men that are exhaled out of the lungs of the wild. I mean, you couldn't imagine an image that is more redolent of classic white anxiety over the tuberculous bacilli that are supposed to come out of African miners. And yet, there are these moments in which he opens up some degree of partial understanding, as you write about. So, but for Kvisser, the safe is so interesting because it means a set of things, presumably to the Zimbabwean. Criminal, we only get little. But then it's also at the heart of another kind of uncanny for of the house for the white protagonist, right? Because the safe signifies everything that is not safe, and that prefigures then the final line of the chapter, which is all about what's in the calendar, this sort of juridical mythos, in which it says, what was the line? The calendar in the court, all people in South Africa are and feel safe, right? So the safe is everything that's not safe. And yet it's so interesting because, as was just pointed out, right, that there's this sort of sexualized connection. It becomes the interiority, the violated interiority not of the house, but of course of the older white woman's body. And so it's just so interesting that the safe is this complicated, contested, floating signifier of different sort of formations of the uncanny, which I agree do seem to be central to the central struggle of the text, which is to reconstitute this thing, the book, that was violated, and simultaneously what he calls in the opening the place of the book, which is Johannesburg. So that the act of writing then becomes the only thing that can sort of steal up again that safe.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, there was a misconception about the safe in the book. The safe, there was in fact a safe that the character had forgotten about. And it's a bit like what I think of as the phenomenology of alarm within South African conditions, where you have copious alarm systems that everywhere work only to alarm the people who use those alarms.
That's exactly terrifying.
They only ever go off on false alarm. And largely, when they go off at the right time, are ineffectual because they rely on response that doesn't arrive responsively enough.
The fantasy of armed response.
Exactly.
Yes, I hadn't thought of but it was very evocative, the idea of the wilds breathing out these...
That opening line is...
And the racialized, the perhaps unconsciously racialized topography of that characterization. I do think it does speak quite resonantly to the deep structures of racialized perception around issues of incursion and danger in South African conditions.
So does, of course, the idea of the safe, which after all, the point of knowledge is the servant in the house. I.e., the South African nightmare of the intimate that
the intimate other,
to violence against
Yeah.
Sorry.
The mic wants
I'm
to-
finished.
And not only the South African, I mean, it's a colonial
Yeah,
nightmare. It's
yeah.
well known in Indian fiction as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the safe as the point in the residence that will secure finally the safety of that which is most valuable. And of course, it also functions as a fantasy of something that needs to be discovered in the characters who come into the house,
Absolutely.
which the safe that's never found.
Yeah, so it's this strange kind of meeting ground.
Yes.
For all the profound social distance.
And it contains the booty, the ill-gotten gains. Yeah.
Which is again a lot.
through intimate knowledge.
Yeah.
Yes.
The servant in
Yeah.
the room.
And beneath the surface. So again, this question of surface and infrasurface is a really complicated thing going on here. You know,
Oh, yes.
They're undercurrents of all kinds. You know, mechanical and psychic and psychoanalytic and so on. Yeah.
Coming back to the notion of loss of plot, my reading is that you would argue that social media and looping is strengthening this idea of loss of plot. Could it be that social media especially gives voices to a lot of people who have been unheard of for a long time, and it's kind of personalizing the plot in a way that just makes it more personal for a lot of different people?
It definitely provides a sense of what you might call multivocality in the public sphere of, you know, if you're thinking about the digital sphere as a public sphere of multiple voices streaming in from all over the place and crossing spaces such as Facebook and Twitter, which are the dominant sites, then yes, an interesting and a notable feature is precisely that, the personal, the feelings of people regardless of their credentials, for example, regardless of their experience, or regardless of their qualifications, a profound kind of democracy of utterance that in and of itself, I suppose, could bring about a sense of a loss of an organized thematization, but certainly in these conditions where I would maintain there is a very strong sense out there among all groups in the country that the once desired plot, and you know, I'm always throwing this back against the sense of it being a founding narrative, because it, in my reading of things, it was very widely held founding narrative. Against that founding narrative, the sense is very widespread that the plot has been lost from various points of view. You know, from a left point of view, from a right point of view, from a centrist point of view, from a white or black point of view, any point of view, there's a sense of the wheels have come off, to use a different metaphor. And so, yes.
Of course, I mean, another, I think we can move it back there. Another aspect, of course, of the online democratic participation is the idea that it also enables certain kinds of fiction, right? Yeah. Because there's the avatar, the fact that you're not known. So it itself doesn't lie down simply. I'm still trying to think of these, you know, these five planes that and how they link to each other. Yeah. That it does also create the possibilities of new kinds of fiction, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, and it is.
And from that point of view, different sorts of
It is bringing those
fictional
forth.
form.
Yeah. So you find work like Kavissa's where you can sense the incursions that are coming into this kind of writing are new media kinds of energies. You find that happening in the fiction as well. You find that particularly in Vladislavic, in the case that I discussed, Double Negative, where he brings in a digital bricoleur in the third part of the book. Her name is Jaina Manpo. And he plays with her kinds of representation against his kinds of representation, against the David Goldblatt figure's kinds of representation. So he plays with different generations of capture on those axes, around those axes.
Because precisely the non-curated nature of the web or the net is what allows, I mean, what loops is not simply the fiction.
Yeah.
What loops are all the different kinds of intersecting genres that are constantly kind of miscegenating, as it were, in this way.
Yes.
Yeah.
But also homogenizing in certain ways. You know, I mean, so the medium democratizes. Yes, everybody has a voice. But what happens when the voice gets transitioned into the hashtag or the meme? In other words, here's the summary of what I've just experienced, and it's this little phrase, you know. And so there's a question there for me about narration and what narration can actually do. And, there's this old concept in literary studies of the mimetic fallacy. Just because something appears to be something doesn't mean that's what it is. So yes, it gives a voice, but at what level does this voice exist, and where does it intersect with other kinds of fictionality which are collective in some way? It's a really interesting question. It's not one that I think we can resolve, but I think it's a question to think about.
Yeah, I would second that. The homogenizing function is one that is distressing and ever noticeable.
Yeah. But these are always very particular contextual questions. They can't be asked in, and this is where a kind of more ethnographic or historically situated reading has to take place.
Yes.
Because in fact they don't simply move in one direction, and a lot of this depends on the way that speech can be recaptured.
Yes.
And this is something that arose out of our discussion at lunchtime, is that the problem with the Celsus wound culture is it's all about the kind of the passive witnessing,
Yes.
as we said, almost standing before the crucifixion, which asks about how new is it, right?
Yes, it does seem overly generalized.
But the point is, it's not dialectically reactive.
Yes.
It doesn't evoke a politics.
It needs a case history.
And a lot, but it also it needs the looking at the reception as well, right?
Yes.
The fact is that people engage these things. Yeah. There's a tremendous amount of debate now, both in South Africa and indeed even in the speech of somebody like Donald Trump, as to how the kind of media of succinct homogenization permit a kind of brutality and shallowness and simplicity.
Well, Donald Trump is a great example of succinct homogenization that is brutal in itself.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely.
And that's precisely what we're seeing in many of the social memes that are circulating, that there is a certain brutality to the univocality of those memes.
Yeah. And an evocative sense that it's calling forth that precise. Okay, you're next.
Thank you again for your very thought-provoking paper. I think one of the lines that really struck me is the blurring of the line between fact and fiction. And I wondered if, when I was reading the paper, whether one of the great powers of fiction is the ability to critique without necessarily ascribing blame or ascribing guilt on the part of the author. And I wondered whether the prominence of fiction within apartheid South Africa was the lack of ability to openly critique the system, and whether the rise of non-fiction in post-apartheid South Africa was due to a greater freedom of speech necessarily to critique the system. But I guess my question to you is, and this came out of our discussion at lunchtime, is would there have been a difference in the significance of Give Us a Story if it had been fiction based on other forms of fact within South Africa and not the factual story itself?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think that it would have been less, would have had less clout had he fictionalized that story, because there's a strong premium in the discourse at the moment on finding out what's true and disaggregating what's true from what's not true, because there's a general perception of a lot of bullshit and too much of it doing the rounds and clouding everybody's vision. So there's this high premium on forensic investigation, or a forensic mode of establishing and refining the establishing and refining the observation. And if you look at Johnny Steinberg's work, it's meta narrative, in the sense that he sifts through many different layers of narrative, and he's an interlocutor between orders, registers of narrative, which is a very important function. He's sifting through the truth claims and the content and the relative worth of various kinds of narration that various people are making. So recently, when he got the Wyndham Campbell Prize at Yale, he said writing about South Africa is like coordinating between deaf people. And it's that sense of mediating between different registers of uncomprehending or non-communicating points of origin. So during apartheid, yes, fiction needed to write, to use allegory, as J.M. Coetzee did famously in Waiting for the Barbarians, as a way of rendering oblique the commentary that was otherwise unpalatable and subject to censorship. And I think you're quite right that the turn after 1994, the embrace to openness, transparency, forms of truth-telling were valorized, especially in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You as a South African person, subject, were encouraged to speak your story. So once again, the the very oft-cited quotation by Sarah Nuttall and Cheryl Ann Michael is South Africa became a recited community. And you have this phenomenon of incredible upsurge in spoken word poetry, for example. I have personal experience of this, and the poets just emerging from everywhere, under every bush, and speaking in hip hop form of their experiences. So that's been the trend. Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, that does raise the question of the appeal of nonfiction in terms of a kind of ideology of truth effects,
yes.
which itself, in fact, has to be plumbed for its rhetorical
yes.
qualities, right?
Yes.
Because, I mean, that idea that we know truth when we recognize it. One of the biggest critiques of the TRC was that, in fact, there were certain kind of truths that were recognizable
yes.
and others not. And people were coached in the ways in which you spoke truth in an exceptional, conventional manner.
Yes.
So one wonders here, again, getting back to the question of the market, you know,
Yes.
as to how much that plays. And also the fact that so much true crime these days, from the series on American television to the Coen brothers' Fargo, starts out by saying this is true crime. And of course
yes.
the whole thing is surrealism. And
yes.
what they're doing is poking, you know,
Yes.
raising a critique
Yes.
about the nature of that kind of claim.
Yes.
Yeah?
No, so
And-
you can
and-
almost
and-
never use the term true crime without the scare quotes,
Exactly.
because you have to make it jump around a little. It's never quite what it professes
Yeah.
to be,
Yeah.
but it's always playing with the possibility of it being true crime
Yeah.
and parrying itself.
So this idea of truth is against bullshit is itself a highly political line that one
Oh,
draws.
yes.
Yeah. Achille, you next.
I'd like to come back to a point, Stefan, you raised a moment ago, which has to do with the question of writing and what you called, many have been calling the real. You put it in this way, what is it that writing can do? I would like to add to that another question, what is it that writing cannot do? I don't want to come back to Lacan and his distinction between the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. Because it seems to me that, to put it in an outrageous manner, it seems to me that there is no such thing as fiction and non-fiction in the first instance. There is no such thing because, at least in the case of South Africa, but also other parts of the world, what is really at work in many cultures and societies today is a recomposition of something we could call the thresholds of believability. It's true what it is that I believe in. And this is absolutely important, for instance, for anyone who would like to make sense of the current so-called decolonization movement.
Yeah.
Truth in the so-called Forism movement is that which carries me forward. It has nothing to do with facts, whether they happened or didn't, who was involved or not. It has to do with believability. So the question, therefore, is why is it that we believe in the myths we believe in? And at what point is it that they become, let's say, unbelievable? It seems to me that metaphysical interrogation on truth as such doesn't help us to account for the work that belief does. And therefore I suggest that we reverse the question or put it rather in that way, which would allow us situationally, as Jean is calling for, to account for processes which otherwise we would think are simply pathological. Now, the other thing is that I think the problem with writing and the real is that the real is always ahead of writing.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I mean, it is always ahead unless we understand the real as being itself a form of writing. If we understand it as being itself a form of writing, then that gap doesn't exist. But if we understand the real to be something other than writing, then it is writing hardly ever do justice to the real, however we want to define it. So maybe the point is really to find out how is it that we inhabit that gap between the writing and the real, whatever it is. How do we inhabit it as a zone not only of tension, contradictions, but of, to use a term John likes to use, and a zone of indecidable and decidability.
Yeah.
Something that cannot be decided. It has no resolution. It is, by definition, of the order of that which cannot be resolved, and that which we have to live with, and it's dangerous to live with it because it implies losses. But for some social actors, it implies gains. They gain agency in inhabiting that space of irresolution. What kind of agency? Of course, that's a question we don't have the time to. One last point. I don't know whether it's you or Leon who mentioned it. My feeling is that just as the Mandela era was a moment of boundary breaking, what we are witnessing now is a moment of boundary making or remaking. It comes out in the form of who has the right to speak.
Yeah.
Who has the right to speak in what kind of public space?
Yes.
And to speak about what? Because, I mean, in those spaces, you cannot just go there and speak about anything. You are expected to speak about there are protocols about what you can speak about, how you can speak about it. Now the question is, of course, as far as some of us are concerned, there is danger in this. The main danger is that what this leads to is to some idea of a community that is, if you want, monolingual. Monolingual in the sense that it is made up of people who recognize each other through the practice of a language they agree on. And if you do not speak in that language, if you do not speak in the terms of this language, you are either an imposter, an interloper, or a stranger. You are not a citizen. You don't belong there. You don't belong there, and you have no right to participate. And you have to shut up. And practices of shutting up people have become an important part of this new politics, politics of viscerality, visceral politics that aims at disassembling and reassembling the polis in ways we have not seen, it seems to me, early on. But this is more of a comment than a question to either of you. It just seems to me that there are so many different ways in which we can try to make sense of the current moment without falling into the binaries and dichotomies. I had thought literary studies had moved beyond long ago. Anyway.
It's going to Daria next.
So those binaries remain in literary studies, categorizations, marketing categorizations, in book history remain important because they are used in the real world of books. And you have a category called fiction, and you have a category called nonfiction, and we agree that these categories overlap and are fluid, and yet they mark certain accents rather than absolute divisions or absolute binaries. They mark the I mean, how do you inhabit the gap, as you ask it, between writing and the real? Well, if you look at the history of post-colonial theory, post-colonial literature, and much thinking and talking around South Africa, the question of who dares speak about whom, for whom, about what, and in what situation is profoundly vexed. So writing non-fiction, or pretending to write non-fiction, or inhabiting nominally the space of non-fiction, is a way for a writer, let's say like Johnny Steinberg, to say, I'm being very careful here. I'm not just making shit up, right? I'm listening to people, I'm taking notes. I'm not only listening to people and taking notes, I'm checking on those notes, I'm checking on those claims, I'm double checking on them, and I'm asking other people as well, and then I'm coming to a position where I can say, this is what the real might have been. This is a good guess on what the real might have been, because I think the question you raise about believability is crucial. What is truth? It's not fiction, it's not non-fiction, but it is a question of what you believe, what profoundly you feel in a position to recognize as the truth.
Can I just add one thing, because it becomes really interesting. And Sarah was telling me, talking about Johnny yesterday, telling me about his latest book on these Somali migrants. And she was indicating to me that at some point in the book, the Somali guy,
Assad,
he's not at all interested in the book.
Yes, that's right.
He's interested in the money that will accrue from the book, which will allow him to buy a truck and then keep moving. And that raises a very interesting question. Who is this for at the end? I mean,
yes.
Who is all of this?
In what sense is it non-fiction?
And
in what sense is it really non-fictional?
I'd like to get
just a quick note on that. In fact, he shows Assad the manuscript, and Assad reads a few pages and drops it. He says, "I'm not interested. I do not want to read my own life story." And Johnny Steinberg speculates on why, and part of the reason why is there's too much loss in it. He can experience his own life as a series of separate events that are not necessarily in chronology or temporally mixed up in his own mind, and phenomenologically don't have a narrative sequence. But the narrative sequence that Steinberg imposes on it is overwhelming, is the word.
Go ahead.
I mean, the questions you raise, Achille, are really important. And this question of undecidability, absolutely, I agree with you on that. And that also makes me think that it's not a question of writing not being able to do justice to the real, but that writing actually has a very important function in relation to the real. And just as you reversed my question, what can writing do into what can it not do, I think one of the things writing can do is not so much say, what can I believe in, but what can I not believe in, okay? I mean, that to me makes good writing, in where the formula is not simply being replicated, where the believable is not simply being replicated, but other questions are being asked. And that has to do with, to use a term that I've used in other contexts before, forms of navigation in the world. It's not a question of what's true and what isn't, but how do I make my way in the world? You know, what's going on? And that's a question that has conscious dimensions, I think it has subconscious dimensions, it has psychoanalytic dimensions, social, cultural, tropological, all kinds of things, you know, but it feels to me that writing has work to do in relation to the real, not in order to capture it, but in order to explore what that relationship is in some form. But, yeah.
But just
and then you move to Dario, who's been waiting patiently.
But it seems to me, Leon, that the challenge here is precisely to explode the categories of popular discourse. It's certainly popular discourse and you know, booksellers operate with, but is that sufficient analytically? It seems to me that precisely the presumption of non-fiction and its relationship to the real is where the problem lies. After all, what we're talking about here are memoirs. Memoirs are undecidable. Do you trust your memory as non-fiction? Hardly. None of us can. Certainly not as an analytic gesture. So the memoir is a genre. What does a memoir do? It precisely is a testament to believability. What does Johnny Steinberg do? Johnny Steinberg writes other people's memoirs. Right? He doesn't write ethnography. He doesn't write. He chooses very deliberately to tell every story. If it's about prison gangs, he tells it about Muhammad. If it's about Saman, he tells it about Assad. If it's about
New Yorker
Mithras,
style of writing.
this is the New Yorker mode of producing the memoir. Now, the memoir is an undecidable form, and Johnny's perfectly honest. I don't know whether this is true. This is what he's telling me. I can go back to where he saw it, and even where he saw it, some of the things aren't actually there. So, in effect, what he's engaged in is not arbitrating between fiction and non-fiction, which basically is an ideological trope that belongs to a particular moment in the rise of empiricism in Enlightenment reason. It seems to me the critical reason says, well, wait a moment, let us try and figure why those things are as tenacious as they are, and why we think we need what it is we need. And of course, there I agree with Achille. We're talking about a phenomenology of creating realities that we cannot decide on. You can write 25 testimonies. That doesn't make one any closer to reality.
Yes.
What one has are 25 arguments about the real.
Yes.
And it seems to me that this is basically what South Africa is about. It's become a community of affliction, as you say, in which the argument, the claim of the relation between the subject and object becomes the essential gesture of all writing. And I think that's true of fiction as well. When Dion Meyer writes about the police, he does what David Simon does. He goes and sits in cop stations, and he tells you something that, as it happens, is very close to the sorts of things that we found as ethnographers about policing. And he tries, in effect, to do similar sorts of things, and to make them as, quote, real as humanly possible. But, of course, it's, again, it's a mimic. It's an argument about a condition of uncontrollability, of undecidability. It seems to me that the metaphor of the argument for South Africa, rather than fiction, non-fiction, is... And this is what Mark is doing. Mark is trying to re-navigate something that he can't possibly grasp. And you do this brilliantly. The non-graspability is the story. So the way he constructs it, with that hook at the beginning and the story at the end, the 293 pages which you all labored through in between, with a lot of difficulty, right? And which I would strongly recommend deleting. Pardon?
Yeah.
So the point being here that he's chosen a particular kind of way to make that argument. There are plenty of other return narratives. After all, Kevin Bloom's done a similar kind of thing. These things repeat over and over. And the question is, why crime? Why not tell the story of the inability to connect across monolingual communities? That's as much a South African trauma as anywhere else. So the choice of the criminal here, in a way, evokes precisely a form of argumentation which seems to have purchase because it resonates with everybody's experience. Everybody in South Africa has been attacked, etc., etc. And in that sense, it uses, as it were, truth devices to make its argument. But it's chosen a very particular argument.
So just to push back on that a little bit is accepting all the points about the almost rhetorical nature of the notions of fiction and non-fiction. I think it does remain very important for writers of literary non-fiction to, in their negotiation of the ungraspable real, which they will acknowledge, of course. I mean, they certainly wouldn't crudely claim that they've got a hold on the real, while fiction writers are only playing with the imagination. But in their struggle with that ungraspability, it remains important for them to say that their means of approach is non-fictional, that is not imagined, not sort of thought through the registers of imagined perceptual sensibilities, which is things that novelists can do very well and have their own uses. So while granting all that, there is still the bonus of saying I'm working particularly to find an approach towards something through the means of forensic realism, documentary realism. Even though it's ungraspable, I'm looking for it in this way. Right?
But by its very nature still, I mean, the imagined is not necessarily the fictional. Right? And it seems to me that what comes out so interestingly here, when Mark talks about memory, I mean, the critical point
Yes.
in this, the problem of identifying this guy, is that his memory fails him.
Yeah.
And it seems to me he's undoing the whole genre there at that point. He's saying, look, I thought I saw him by a process of elimination.
Yes,
And then I
yes,
come, it's not
yeah,
him, and I'm told
yeah.
it's a different man.
Yes. Oh, yes.
So the whole
Oh,
sense
yes.
there of any kind of
Yes.
real realist fiction seems to me to be,
Yes.
he's undoing it from the inside.
Yes.
So he's
Absolutely.
working, maybe that's his
Yeah.
point of departure.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the fact is he's working to
Yes.
to undo that
Yes.
quite in a Derridian kind of manner,
Yes.
quite from the
No,
inside.
no, quite. I mean, and he certainly does it very well. But you need to ask the question: why is Mark Visser? Why is Johnny?
Well, that's the question
why
I
is
want you to
Jacob
ask.
Blamini? Why do they choose this category called literary non-fiction? Why don't they write novels? And I do think there's a fundamental difference of approach. Yeah, is that they do not feel that they have the standing or the ability, or they don't want to make that presumption about the truth. Well, make any presumption about the truth except that which they can seek to establish in as problematic as it is in the actual world, is in the documented world, in the world that can be found via some sources of evidence.
Maybe
at
it's
least.
more a category of prize than it is. I mean, I wonder how much they type themselves, is what I'm saying. I know that, of course, one starts out in the everyday kind of sense, but it seems to me the ability to take flight within the safety of the genre and the form is precisely what they're exercising. Darian, and then we go.
So,
I'm coming to
no.
the back. I have not forgotten.
This is a
Yeah.
fascinating exchange. I'm going to try to modify then my questions, readings to fit into this exchange. So I was thinking back to Sarah Nuttall's paper a few weeks ago on the Anthropocene, and she was pushing us very much to think about the non-human and where, particularly, what the Anthropocene, how to push ourselves to think about form, which has very much come up tonight, and particularly pushed us to think about where the social lies in the novels and stories that she used to talk about the Anthropocene moment. So, and to sort of riff off what's just been said, it seems like a lot of the social here is, or what stood out to me in the excerpt, I haven't read the whole book, but I read the excerpt that we were given, is these moments of social failure, of these moments inability to connect. So the later one is in the courtroom where Gevisser, who starts out being able to read the whole attack and this whole invasion in a very sort of objective, historicized way about the structures of domination and inequality that have produced it, and he, all these humane moments that he identifies in the attack itself, and then he himself sort of progresses to this anger in the courtroom, which is the climax, as I understood it, was that the Zimbabwean thug wouldn't look him in the eye. So there's this failure of human to human, also across racial lines, recognition of being able to look him in the eye. And then another point in which I thought this was fascinating in this excerpt was that he said, I wasn't actually, in the days that followed, I was traumatized, but I wasn't actually angry about what had happened or angry towards the three attackers. I was angry mostly at people's responses to my story, and people's inability to read my experience or to deliver an appropriate response. And I noticed that actually the sentiment of anger came again, and though it was unmarked, it felt to me like a lot of those interlocutors would have been white. There was also, friends who had gone through similar experiences recently, so there's kind of this black on white crime dimension here that I read. And I think this for me was quite fascinating because it also links back, in some ways it links back to a non-human moment, the technological moment. So he says we've outsourced our memories to cell phones, so when they stole my cell phone I couldn't reach anyone, I couldn't remember anyone. And then there's, of course, there's also the failure of the human. So it kind of links up to the non-human and to Sarah's work in some ways, and I'm kind of pushing this, but stretching this. But to the failure of the social being refracted not only along, well, to put it bluntly, across black and white lines, because the perpetrator can't look him in the eye, and then his sort of if I read it properly, a lot of his white interlocutors are unable to give him an appropriate response. And so there's like this failure of humanity. And I think another thing, sort of, as an anthropologist, that was fascinating for me in this excerpt was, he said, you know, people kept telling me, but there was that other moment. A number of people said to me they must have really hated you personally, or they had some personal vendetta against you. And he kept trying to push back. No, this happens to people all the time, and this is, you know, this is an expose of the society we live in, and they didn't know us, and you know, they didn't know us in any personal way, and they had no personal vendetta. So, the way I read this also was like there was this, and forgive me if my language isn't quite precise enough, but this kind of white victim community that was trying to personalize it for him or his social entourage, to say like there must have been something very personal here. And he kept pushing back and trying to experience this in a sort of more objective, distanced way. But in the end, of course, he developed his own. And then ironically, his personal experience, again, he says, it was inevitable that I would walk around the streets and see young black men who dressed the same way, and I would think of them. So this tension, not only between, well, this goes back to the public and private, I guess, and sort of thinking about how the failure of the social, like how the failure of communities to agree upon being able to step back from personal trauma and pain and constitute a new, like, multiracial society, and the inability to therefore distance oneself from one's personal trauma, but that sort of public-private and the failure of the social were entangled here.
Yeah,
I wondered.
there does seem to be a failure of the ability to ground the experience in any kind of a coherent theory of the social, but there's also institutional failure. There's a familiar story, which is the meaning of this attack becomes increasingly tenuous and unclear as it moves further into the institutional processes of juridical reckoning, and you know, we're not even entirely sure that they've got the right guy, and the predictable senses of vindication through justice doesn't really feature strongly. It becomes a process in frustration. And as you say, the conversations with fellow subjects who are concerned about the event are estranging conversations. They are not happy conversations, and so the very attack itself, despite its foregrounding as narratively as a kind of event of true crime, where you might think that you can see what's happening and what's right and what's wrong, increasingly ungrounds itself as the book proceeds. And it appears by the end that it is only really by an act of strong assertion, authorial assertion, that he pulls it back together and stitches together a society or a ground of hope.
So I guess, and in that sense, it seemed like that the social was failing at the one-on-one, at the intersubjective level, at the private and the public
And
level.
yet I'm not entirely convinced by that stitching together, precisely because it has to be done so very pointedly.
Exactly. Okay, sorry, you've waited a long time.
It's fine. Look, I want to see if we can go back to this earlier theme of the loss of the possibility of depth. That's what Stephen called the loss of loss. And at the very beginning, you introduced yourself as a literary critic, you know, against the backdrop of this extraordinary CD. You said, I'm a literary critic. So what do you think, how do you think literary criticism can proceed without stepping back, slowing down, taking time, not looking at tweets? You know, the world you're describing is a world which makes it very difficult for a literary critic to actually inhabit. And there's a larger motivation for this question, because I think it's a question for all of us in the public in this, you know, neoliberal subjectivity. We're supposed to make and take opportunities and not hesitate and not, so this is a question way beyond.
Oh that's a great question.
And of course,
what is the literary critic?
When I say stepping back, it's also thickening the connections, whether they're sort of internal to the psychology or external to the context in order to do your literary criticism that you've been doing today.
So I mean, this harks back to Stephen's sort of axes of various axes of the global and the local, and axes of temporality, and surface and depth and so on, that literary critics have to deal with nowadays with quite some attention to detail, rather than just reading texts well and commenting on them according to their sort of individual tastes. About literature, there's just so many other forces and energies and factors coming into what we would regard as literature, particularly in the case of post-apartheid literature. What I'm arguing in this book is that the categories, although they're porous and they certainly don't stand solidly as opposed to each other in binary connections, the categories have to be broadened, and you have to at least see the manner in which new media forms of writing and cultural expression are drifting into the book writing. So take Greg Marinovich's new book. It comes from a series of social dispatches, journalistic dispatches that eventually are refined and put together in a book, and it carries the energy of this notion of the shock of contact, the space of public witnessing, the moments of referred pain, and these elements that one might identify as belonging to media witnessing and true crime in that sense is coming into book production and into the literary sphere, and what do you do with it? And what I'm saying is, recognize it for what it is, broaden your categories, and deal with it in that sense, accordingly.
Do you feel kind of like that's an aspiration, but you might be being left behind, swept away, rendered irrelevant by things moving too quickly, by things staying on the surface? Because you want to make the connections, you want to...
Yes, well, exactly. I mean, literary critics...
Is there an anxiety?
Yes, there's an anxiety about getting it wrong, and then there's anxiety about not seeing it all for what it is. And so, what does writing do? I mean, one is chasing this question: what can writing do? That Achille poses and that Stephen poses. It's always chasing the real. How is it doing this? How successfully is it doing this? What's it not succeeding in doing? So the questions to me are, particularly post-apartheid literature, what is it doing, what is it not doing? And those questions one has to pursue.
But there might be some anxiety about being not picked up, not turned into a meme or not turned into something believable too, no?
No, we can control whether they're made into a meme. We are all infinite signifiers. Will we pass the January?
Remain all in mimesis.
And then we'll pass.
So I'm a comparativist with things that I was sort of bred in a disciplinary context of high anxiety, so that seemed like it was perfectly scripted. But my question for you is of a more meta-pragmatic nature, I guess, in the sense that some of the limitations of the writing that people seem to be speaking about are either reflective of or, in fact, caused by the limitations of the critical discourse that's in play. And in particular, I want to press on how prevalent the surface depth thing is, and I frankly wish Sharon Marcus had never written an article sometimes, because Sharon herself doesn't do this, right? Sharon, if you get her in a room, does not think there's any such thing as surface or depth, because the metaphor is fundamentally untenable. And there's a fabulous literary scholar, Kevis Goodman, working on surface and depth in histories of the Scottish Enlightenment, and she talks about it in relation to nosology versus pathology. So kind of Hume and Surrounds. It says as soon as you are talking about nosology, namely the study of diseases laterally, right, how one disease relates to another, you are already absolutely in the terrain of talking about pathology. There is no way to speak of surface in any coherent way without already invoking depth. So I guess I'm wondering to what extent being forced within this language that's become very trendy, and the special issue is like this, suddenly representations is on the map again and everyone's going to talk about it.
To what extent is that actually obscuring some of the work that you're trying to do
I think
here?
you're right.
And going back to Gilles' point about the real, it also seems that there's a way in which the surface depth lexicon is grabbing on to a particularly American and then post-colonialized version of post-structuralism without actually going into the structuralist heritage from which it comes, which could give us a path to let literary studies actually speak in a very potent way to social problems rather than constantly trying to import sociology, and usually gears, right, for surface readers, back into literary studies. So if you talk about not the real in these very vague Lacanian terms, but actually the genealogy of thinking about plot in Lévi-Strauss and in Ricoeur and in all of the theorists in that kind of French history that end up at this big notion of the real, then you have to ask, well, what are you doing? So in a more kind of microcosmic fashion, I guess, I want to know if you dispense with surface depth, you get rid of it altogether, and rather think in a more structuralist vein, what is technically happening with the work you're talking about? Is it a recession of the event? Is it an issue of the Chapman sort of narratological satellites and kernels not working in the same way? Some of what you're describing, the move toward nonfiction, sounds a lot like modernism, and what happens in the kind of modernist turn in the mid-20th century to form. So what could a more specifically and technical literary toolbox say about the social world of South Africa, as opposed to trying to kind of reduce what Achille does in a very different type of training and discipline into a literary hermeneutics?
Well, I do think the surface depth contrast is essential. I mean, absolutely agree with you that it doesn't really hold as binary, as an opposition at all, because it only works as two terms working together and giving each other meaning, right? Supplementing each other's meaning, making each other possible, in fact. Academics do this. I mean, academics correct from earlier positions and overcorrect. So, you know, that's one way of looking at the surface depth argument, that it was an overcorrection from histories of what was perceived as over depth, or too much depth analysis, too much obscuring of what was patently on the surface of text. And this is what gets argued with, too much ignoring of what you actually see and what you actually feel just by reading ordinarily, instead of obscuring the surface, you know, in a sense, letting it come out, letting it stand out in relief. But as Imran Kavadia said in a debate I was in with him recently, you know, academics should sometimes have their toys taken away from them, because this is an example of that kind of overcorrection. But on the bigger question you raise, I think the point is implicit, and that's your point.
But it's a very important point you're making, because in fact the degree to which Goetz and that kind of, and the simplistic view of Goetz is simply reading surfaces over the shoulders of the shoulder. The hermeneut is a misreading of Goetz, actually, because Goetz is a Weberian for whom, in fact, there is no hermeneutics without a larger field from which it emerges.
You fundamentally can't have a hermeneutics of surface. It
You
doesn't make
can't,
sense.
by very definition. And the same with the question, the point about structuralism is not so much about depth and surface, it's about all meaning is relational.
Exactly.
It's relational, and you can't simply pick up terms, and therefore there is no truth of a single concept. You can't translate this. It is systemic by its very nature. It's a very important point you made, because I think we do get too easily mislaid.
Yes. But just to play the devil's advocate.
Mike.
Oh, sir.
I just want to play the devil's advocate since we are just about to stop.
The devil wants his dinner.
The devil, yeah, he wants his. The problem with Sharon Marcus and
Stephen.
Yes, is that they play with the concept of surface, but they do not really restitute the genealogy of the concept.
Mm-hmm.
The concept of the surface originates from a radical critique of capitalism.
Yeah.
In the work, for instance, of Krakauer, and in the work of Zimmel.
And you were talking about Zimmer, which is, by the way, where stranger intimacy comes from, but that's another matter.
Yes.
Yeah.
A lot of the what strikes me, Leon, is that a lot of the terms in your paper are very Zimmer-like and are very Krakow-like. So it seems to me that there's something to recover in the concept of the surface, as long as these, here we go again, deep history of the concept is taken into account. It's taken into account in an age when capitalism, as we all know, is rapidly mutating, becoming more and more abstract, and the combination of financialization and digitalization makes it such that the form we are dealing with maybe is not a surface form, maybe it pertains more to the domain of the luminous or the screen.
The screen is the key.
The screen here, it seems to me, is absolutely the key.
Yeah.
So if we are able to link the surface to its deep history in critique of capitalism and connected to this major event of our time, which is the advent of the screen, which we keep touching. I mean, we spend most of our time
palpating the screen,
touching, caressing, stroking the screens. Then it seems to me that there's something to recover from let's say, use of such a term.
But the screen there is a reification, right? It's not a thing in itself, in the very nature of that analysis, Achille. I mean,
screen also isn't structurally meaningful. I mean, in neurological terms, you would have synchronic versus diachronic way of reading a text.
Exactly.
You don't read as a screen. The screen brings some sort of structural principle to the
fore,
fore, right? I mean, it's...
And it has connections. I mean, it emerges from a
hopefully it
whole
brings a
mode
bit
of
of depth.
production, you know, and set of relations. Otherwise, it doesn't. Yeah. And then we move to
just two quick points on this, because I know we're going to end. I mean, it seems to me approaching surface and depth, it's not as if they are discrete categories. What really interests me about them is how they are transactional. What kind of surface generates what story of depth? What kind of story of depth generates what kind of story of surface? It's a big theoretical question, and it seems to me a very important one. Probably we don't have time to discuss it right now. But one thing I would say about getting back to Lost and Found is I wish it had asked more of these questions. You know, there's a guiding metaphor in this book, which is the metaphor of the Holmden's map of Johannesburg, and it's about crossing all these boundaries. And I wish it had considered the boundary less as a line that you cross and much more of a space that you inhabit, and a very complicated space at that, one in which you make up believable stories or unbelievable stories, in which identity is provisional, in which connections are provisional. You know, that to me, I don't really care whether it gets called fiction or non-fiction or whatever it gets called. That to me becomes a form of writing which becomes necessarily interpretable. In other words, it needs to be interpreted. It doesn't carry its own interpretation on its surface, if I can use that word. In other words, it says, I don't know exactly what's going on here. Help me in this process, right? That to me is a work of writing that can engage us. And that's the kind of work, going back to Peter Taylor's question, which gives us, as literary critics, something to do, you know? Gives us a job. That's important, you know.
So now we understand.
And beyond fiction.
So is it
don't have anything to do any longer.
short, huh? Because we've got to go.
Yeah. I think my points are covered, but just to follow up, it's more of a comment, not a question. As much as we are questioning the difference between fiction and non-fiction and the receiver, I think there's also a transition and there's a space of articulation, right? And I think articulation plays a very important role, especially when we are talking in decolonization language. And I think language itself is a very unequal space. The very foundation of language, which is a branch of knowledge, plays its role. And it's not very metaphysical at all, actually, because it is more of an engagement and not an abstract concept to be distant from. So the articulation, who gets to articulate it, what gets to be articulated, and who, the reader, the subject, is being forced to think about that articulation. So the commodity of writing is very much at play. And I think this very unequal juncture that we are in, where people cannot articulate, and there is a huge gap. And as anthropologists, we tend to articulate for them. And I think that's a very vulgarization of a certain genre. And I don't know how do we rescue those people who are struggling to articulate.
Well, critically, just very briefly, I mean, the question of non-fiction and fiction is usefully deployed in the interest of a certain kind of articulation. What you think of that distinction is a different matter, but the articulation is better launched, I think, in many of these writers' views, from the point of view of a declared non-fictional stance, because it gives them the ability to better articulate, or closer to the facts, closer to the heartbeat of what is presumably going on.
Yeah. I'm going to close by just posing a rhetorical question, and thanking you for an incredibly rich seminar. All of this comes round to a question I wanted to ask you from the beginning. One was actually just simply to think about melancholia, because the loss of loss has been wonderfully dealt with in some ways by people like Blomhansen, who've made the point that there are populations who, as Sheila was pointing to now, who are not able to even name their losses from the past. It's a past that you cannot mourn. Right? So it's a kind of a loss of a loss. It seems to me, and this comes back to something I think Stephen was saying, I think that a psychoanalytic dimension pokes through a lot of what you're saying here. It could be made more explicit. And the other interesting question is, what is unique about you? You have a very strong sense in the way you narrate this of a kind of South African exceptionalism. There's something about our past that was so real and I wonder, I think there are phases in many social fields where that happens. But that always raises warning bells for me. World War I and the trenches was something unreal to the degree that a whole rationalist civilization was undone by it, and it produced the most extraordinary works of poetry and fiction. And recently there's been stuff coming out of places like Chernobyl, which is kind of post-apocalyptic imagery and fiction, which is extreme. I mean, these are words that people, they're overwhelmingly strange and threatening and apocalyptic, and they're producing amazing works of imaginative fiction. So one wonders, and I'll leave it, we can talk over dinner, but the question is there really something so distinctive about the South African past that we have to tell the story about an overwhelming realism that burdens the critic and the writer in ways that are unparalleled? Or is this a mode of human predicament that comes back to this question of what kind of historicity is this? Yeah, and where does it link? But thank you so much. This was a wonderful session.
Actually, that raises the impact of Ta-Nehisi coats, of course.